Michael Heller, you are a professor of real estate law at Columbia University School. You focus on private property laws and international property dilemmas. And your previous book was The Gridlock Economic, and the other one is The Choice Theory of Contracts. Jim Salzman, you are a professor of environmental law at UCLA Law School, and you have written 12 books while you have been keeping busy in diverse topics as drinking water, trade, and environmental conflicts. And today we're here to talk about the book that you guys co-wrote together, Mine, How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Life. Michael and Jim, welcome to the podcast. Yes, that's it, Jim. Welcome
It's
to the
such a pleasure
podcast.
to be here. It's great to be here with you, Alon.
Perfect. Okay, so the way that I do the podcast is that I ask for some background information. So let's say, Jim, how do you choose to get into law and became a professor later on?
Sure. So I actually am a tree hugger by training. So before I went to law school, I worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a field biologist. I went to law school and I realized that this was a way to really make a difference. Right. The working out in the field. I loved working out in the field with the wild ponies and such, but I could see what was happening to the environment around us, and so I wanted to basically go into an area where I could both train students and also professionally work with governments to try to protect the environment.
Wow. One of the things about environment that really hit me hard is that I'm vegan. And I see the damage that is caused to the environment by our consumption of meat. And well, there is a simple solution, just stop eating meat, but I don't think that's that's the solution that also will prevent any other coronavirus in the future. But that's not a solution.
That's a separate podcast.
Yeah, that's not a solution that we are willing to look at right now. And Michael, can you tell us a little bit about your background? How do you get into law?
Before I went into law and law teaching, I spent years working in developing countries, bringing drinking water to very poor communities. So I worked in barrios in Latin America. I worked in Bangladesh, and then I worked for 4 years in socialist countries. When communism fell, I was usually part of the very first team in trying to create market economies after the communist countries fell. And then from that, I went into law teaching more than law practice.
Well, I heard of a charity called Charity Water that seems to be very popular and is all over social media. The founder seems to be very social media savvy. And yeah, a lot of people are becoming more and more aware of this social issue. Okay, so you guys got together and to write this book, Mine. How did the idea came about, first of all? And then how do you manage to put it together? Because I had tried to work with my girlfriend, for example, and it's difficult. So here you are, two guys, one in one end of the country and the other one in the other one, obviously with, similar, but also diverse ideas. And I just know that it's not easy.
Sure. So let me start with that. So I'm a big fan of Freakonomics. And if you look at Freakonomics, kind of the structure of Freakonomics, really what it's doing is it's teaching pretty simple microeconomics through very clever stories, right? So why do drug dealers live with their mothers? Why do sumo wrestlers cheat? And the question that Mike and I sort of started with is, why isn't there Freakonomics for how we own things? Because Freakonomics basically says incentives matter. And once you know that and you start looking for individual incentives, the world makes a lot more sense. And it's the identical thing with ownership. Ownership is around us all the time. We make decisions based on ownership rules literally hundreds of times a day. It's whether you're at the front of the line or the back of the line. It's where you live. It's where you drive. It's what you eat. These are all driven by rules of ownership. And our goal in writing this book was basically for people to just, as they do with Freakonomics, suddenly see the world differently. Once you start looking for ownership, the world really does look very different, and you can't unsee it.
Right. And how do you make it work together, Michael? How did that coordination work out?
Well, when you think about kids on a playground, usually one of them grabs a shovel and says, mine. And the other one says, no, it's mine. I had it first. So that's mine versus mine. And that isn't how we work together. So it turns out that as grown-ups, we figured out a way to, instead of have mine versus mine, we figured out a way to make this actually ours, which means sort of drawing a boundary outside our individual contributions to the larger project as a whole. And just very practically, that means years of sending drafts back and forth, having sentences that started with one of us and then moved to the other and then moved back. I hope you're doing well with your girlfriend. That's all in some ways a harder relationship to manage, but co-authoring is actually has many of the upsides without some of the challenges of living with someone.
Okay, so from looking at the book, I see that it's composed mostly of the stories that we tell ourselves about ownership. And you talk about first come, first serve, possession is 9% of the law, etc., etc. I wonder if we could start by maybe sharing one of those stories and how we understand it correctly and how we don't understand it correctly.
Sure. So let me go back to the example that Michael gave and sort of spin that out, and then we can turn it on its head. So Michael's talking about a fight you'll see in any playground, right? So these kids are fighting over a red plastic shovel, and they're both saying, mine, 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 right? One says it's mine because I had it first.
Right.
But let's say they put it down, and then another kid just picked it up and says, no, it's mine because I'm holding on to it. We hear this as mine versus mine, but really it's battling stories. One is claiming possession based on first come, first served. The other is claiming possession on current ownership. I'm holding on to it right now. And one of the key things to understand is there's no right answer, right? Ownership is always up for grabs. And so we're forced to choose between those two conflicting stories. And there really are two conflicting rules, right? We see first come, first serve when you go to a deli, right? You take your number, right? Head of the line, you go there. Current possession. If I'm sitting in the parking space, you can't simply, move my car out of the space. I'm holding on to it. And so a lot of what goes on with ownership is deciding which rule basically is going to win, right? So that's sort of one of the sort of main themes of the book. The second main theme of the book, I'll pass it over to Michael, is how these sayings actually that we take for granted turn out many times to be wrong in practice.
But Jim, where does rules come from? And does it come from ancient England or before that, or it's just innate in us? Who created those rules?
That's a great question. So Jim mentioned two of the rules, being first and possession. Being first goes back to the Bible, because one of the most ancient rules, I had it first. The first to discover a country was the owner. The first to find a new place to grow crops was the owner. So that rule, the first in time rule, goes back to the earliest parts of ancient history. It's the same with possession. That may be even deeper. The notion that it's mine because I'm holding on to it, that goes back to animal biology. So you asked, how deep is it? Ownership is so deep, much of it is actually instinctual. So some of these stories, like first in time and ownership, go back to the sort of prehistory of humanity. There are only 6 of these stories. We've mentioned being first and possession as 2 of them, but each of them are very deeply and anciently rooted. What's so impressive for companies that understand how ownership really works, part of how they push you around as a consumer is that they take these very deep-rooted and instinctual stories, like first in time, and then they turn the story upside down. So instead of being first come, first served, which is what you expect, they often will turn the story upside down and make it first come, last served. You're waiting in line, but the company has figured out a way to bring somebody else in from the side. So one of the real lessons about ownership is not just that it's mine versus mine, story versus story, but that savvy businesses in particular have figured out how to use those instinctive and very deep stories to get their way in ways that are very hard for consumers to even realize.
Are these stories seen from a North American point of view, or are these stories similar globally?
The stories are universal. How we apply them obviously has a cultural context. But the reason they're universal is that anytime you have a scarce, valuable resource, you got to decide who gets it, right? So ownership conflicts are unavoidable. And the reason we have ownership rules is so we don't kill each other too often, right? So, just for example, go back to the creation myth of the Judeo-Christian religion, right? So God says to Adam and Eve, nice place. You can call it Eden, right? The Garden of Eden. Frolic, do whatever you want. You see that tree over there? You see that fruit? It's mine. Don't touch, right? And what happens? You know, they take the fruit, and human history quite literally begins. And one of the very first actions of human history is the notion of property. Because what are Adam and Eve in the garden if not trespassers all of a sudden? And God says, get out. You can't come back in.
If you look at kids around the world, what words do they learn? Pretty universally, one of the first words kids learn is mama, in whatever language. It varies. But within the first handful of words in every culture in the world is mine. They learn mama, they learn no. In some countries they learn ball, but mine is always one of the very first words. The instinct, the impulse to ownership is absolutely fundamental, not just in animals, but also in human psychology and development as well. It's part of what makes understanding the rules of ownership so powerful, because you can really steer people to do what you want by leveraging, by sort of using that natural and instinctive understanding that people bring with them from their earliest childhood to their adult lives in every single place in the world, for every single resource in the world.
Right. And would you say that we started codifying some of these ownership rules at the beginning of the agricultural revolution? Because before that, we had open plains, and if someone would kill a buffalo, we would all share the buffalo or whatever. But then we had agriculture, and then we started dividing our plots of land, and then we had our crops here, and those are your crops. But that's just my idea. Would you say that's the beginning, or was it even before that?
It's the notion of ownership is very much before and independent of the law. People get very, in our culture today, in Canada where you are, in the United States where we are, people radically overestimate how important law is. Much more of our relationships are governed by informal, instinctive, casual ways that we interact with each other that are very deeply rooted and aren't that different from the prehistory that you were talking about. There is law, but that isn't really what drives ownership as much as these very basic instincts and drives.
Right.
Okay. So just to give you an example today, like when you sit on the beach and you put your blanket down and you say, that's my space.
Yeah.
Right. That's mine. It's not the law, but people absolutely respect that independent of the law. And I don't know that was any different in prehistoric times that you're talking about.
Right. You know, now that you mentioned the beach, I hate it when I go to the gym and there's the one guy who puts 10 towels in 10 different machines to show ownership. That's mine. No, I'm using that, and I'm using that too. And yes, I'm using this as well. And it just drives me crazy. And I feel like, no, you know, you
right. But if you sort of think, it's sort of, you know, start to dig into why do you think that? You think that because you have in your head a sense of what the rule is. And the rule presumably is, you know, one towel per person or something like that. And one of the times when ownership breaks down and you get conflict is in one of two settings, right? One of them is the rules are not shared.
Right.
But the other, which is much more common, is when the rules are shared and someone chooses to ignore them. And then you don't have the force of the state because it's not, you know, law. And we have to figure out, are we going to respect the understanding or not?
Right.
So
10 towels, right? Yeah, 10 towels is too many. One towel is okay. How about 2 towels? How far can you push ownership using towels? That's the real ownership system, is the towel on the weight machine.
Right. And that annoys the hell out of me. Okay, so you open the book with the case of the airplane seat, you know, the person leaning back and then invading the space of the other one. And I had seen the video in YouTube long before I even knew about your book, Mine. And yeah, you make it clear that there's just as many people giving saying that one person is right versus the other person. And then could you first of all explain the scenario, and then who is right?
Let me ask you a question, Alon. Do you lean back or do you sit up straight when you're on an airplane?
You know, I sit straight unless unless I see the other person, you know, leaning back, sleeping. So usually I try to be consider the other person behind me, and I try to, you know, just stay straight.
Half the world agrees with you. So the example Alana is asking about is an example that we develop in our book. And it's what we want you as listeners to be thinking about. So when you get on an airplane, and it may have been a while for some of you, what happens? Do you lean back? Do you say, hey, it's the little button on the side on the chair is attached to my seat. So that wedge of space behind my seat, that's mine. It's attached to my seat, and therefore it's mine. Or do you do what Alon does and say, no, that space in front of my seat is for my laptop. It's for my knees. That's my space. And if someone leans into it, the person in front leans into me, they're trespassing. They're taking what I had first, what I possessed. So leaning back a seat on the plane may not seem like a big deal. It's something like Alon says. He tries to work it out. He tries to be considerate. But that little moment of whether or not you lean back is one of the most intense property conflicts you can encounter. It's the person leaning back saying it's mine. The space is mine because it's attached to something mine. That's one of the 6 simple stories everyone uses to claim everything. And the person in back saying, no, you're trespassing. I had it first. Another of the stories. So that's a mine versus mine conflict. It's 2 of the basic stories in conflict. And what's most impressive about that interaction is Alon feels he has to be polite. And people get mad at him, he gets mad at them. And neither he nor the other passengers get mad at the airlines, who deliberately designed ownership to make it ambiguous about whether Alon can lean back or not. That's the whole point. Airlines profit by selling that same space twice. They are masters of ownership engineering. And the way they engineer ownership on an airplane is to sell Alon space for his knees and the same space for the person in front of him to lean back. And the airlines, using that ambiguity about who owns the space, they force Alon and the people behind them and in front to work it out. It's the genius of ownership engineering. If you don't realize it, you get mad at the person in front rather than at the airline. And it's the same problem, not just for airlines. That same ambiguity is how Facebook is taking your online data.
Okay, but considering that there has been so many disputes and actual fist fights, how come it hasn't been codified yet? How come the airline hasn't come up and say, okay, this is what it is?
What's your guess, Alon? What's your guess?
Well, I assume that they would like to get it, keep it ambiguous because they continue profiting from it. But there have been a whole bunch of arguments, fist fights, and people landing back in the airport. So by this time, I think there should have been enough legal action in order to codify it in some way.
Alon, you're hired. You got it exactly right. It turns out to be sufficiently profitable for the airlines to sell the same space twice on every seat, on every airplane, on every flight, every day. They make so much money doing that they're willing to tolerate the occasional fistfights. So if it changes to the point where there are more fights, then you can imagine the change. The airlines actually have a rule, which is the person with the button can lean back. They just don't tell you the rule because they profit from the ambiguity.
Wow. Okay.
And they could design around it as well. There are seats now that are pre-climbed, right? You can't actually lean back. It just takes the issue away. But there's another interesting question that arises in this airplane story. I mean, it's a simple story, but it reveals so much about the nature of ownership. So 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have these fights, right? So what's changed? Well, a few things have changed. The first is we use the seat tables differently. We now use laptops, right? Before it used to just be for some lousy snacks. Second thing is people are bigger, right? So there's less space. But here's the kicker. The third is that airlines are squeezing more people into a steel cylinder. The distance between the seats, called pitch, has decreased by about 5 or 6 inches over the last 10, 20 years. And a decrease of 1 inch of pitch on a plane is worth an extra row of seats.
Wow. Yeah.
And so it's a classic case where as a valuable resource becomes scarcer, the rules of ownership become more contested.
Right. Okay, so we have 6 ownership stories in the book. Can you share, I don't know, by one of the other 5 that we haven't talked about?
Well, it depends on what's of most interest for your audience. But one I think that may be of some interest is the one that we call the meek shall not inherit the earth, which has to do with family ownership. It's mine, not because I was first, because I possess it, because I worked for it. It's mine because I'm in the family.
Right.
And it turns out that in many countries, and America is one of them, you have 2 different systems of ownership, if you're rich and if you're poor. So for example, in America, it has recently become the case in the last 10, 20 years that one very small state, a state that actually borders Canada, but very few Americans have ever visited, named South Dakota, has become the world's haven for money. Rich Canadians, rich Americans, rich Europeans hide their money in South Dakota. It's a place where they can avoid paying their spouses, their ex-spouses, avoid paying their children. That's where they can stiff creditors of all sorts. It's where they can hide money from governments. It used to be the case when you think of where do super rich people hide money, you would say Switzerland or Cayman Islands. But one of the powerful things about ownership is that very small changes in the rules of ownership can lead to radical changes in wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is something that we're concerned a lot about as a society all over the world. And it's not natural. It's not market forces don't create this. The kind of radical wealth inequality that we see today is created by small changes in far off places like South Dakota that really entrench, that create new global aristocracies, not just in the US, but in Canada and Europe as well. So the meek get one set of ownership rules, and the super rich get a different ones. If you're super rich, you already know to stash your money in South Dakota. Other people might not be aware of that yet.
That's new. So what's happening in South Dakota? How come rich people are going there? How's the law different?
Well, one of the things about ownership is that it's not, as we said before, it's not natural. It's not God-given. It's something that's up for grabs and open to change. So in America, unlike some European countries and to some extent in Canada, in America, each state, so New York State or California or South Dakota, can create its own ownership rules. So one state, a poor state like South Dakota, doesn't really care so much about taxes, about educating its children, can sort of have money flow in from wealthier states and wealthier countries, and nobody can really stop them. So very small changes in the law can lead to just massive inflows, $1 trillion or somewhere on that order of magnitude flowing into South Dakota in the last few years from places from countries like Switzerland, where rich people used to stash their money. So rich people are very good at creating ownership rules that benefit them. The challenge, though, is for the rest of us to realize what's happening. So part of the message we want to get across to your audience is to be aware that these radical changes in ownership in ownership and inequality don't just happen by magic. They are brilliantly engineered heist by some of the wealthiest people in the world. And once you realize it, you can change it. It's not inevitable that South Dakota will do this. It's really a choice that we can undo once we realize it's happening.
Wow. Well, I'm income inequality. I mean, it's a broad topic, but one of my ideas is just the globalization. It's just that I can sell this product now all over the world, so I can be huge by having 10 cents from every citizen in the world from buying my product. While before we had just my little region, my little town where I could just be the wealthiest person in that town, but that was my geographical limitation. No.
So what we hope is that with your podcast, we hope that your podcast reaches everybody in the world. You know, this is the way it should be. You should be a global podcast entrepreneur.
I'm working hard at it.
We're happy to help.
Wow. Okay. Well, can you tell me one more time the title of your book, and then where can people follow you?
So the book is called Mine, How the Hidden Rules of Ownership, yep, here we go, thank you. Mine, How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives. And the pie on the front, hopefully everyone can relate to, saying it's my piece of pie. It's published by Doubleday, and it's coming out on March 2nd.
2 more points. You can read about the book at we have a super great website, which is www.mindthebook.com, mindthebook.com. We have videos on there. We actually have a free download of a part of the book about how online tech giants sell you things you don't really own. You click the buy now button, you get something, and then it disappears. So we've made that part of the book available for free. And you can get to that through our website as well, through mindthebook.com.
And where can people, okay, so I guess through the mind.com, people can also find out about you and follow you personally, right?
Yeah, we can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. The book is on sale on March 2nd. So we hope that you pre-order it now. It turns out today that pre-ordering books makes a huge difference for the authors. So if you like what we have to say, it's a real gift for us if you order it ahead of the launch on March 2nd.
Jim and Michael, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.